The order is sealed, Your Majesty, and it is signed by your mother.
It began on a grey Thursday morning at Clarence House, when a senior private secretary placed a single envelope on the king's breakfast table, an envelope older than his reign, sealed in dark red wax, bearing the cipher of the late Queen Elizabeth II. King Charles had prepared for many crises since his accession. He had prepared for scandal, for illness, for the slow machinery of grief. What he had not prepared for was a document written in his mother's own hand, one that banished his wife, Queen Camilla, from every crown residence in the kingdom. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The secretary did not speak as he set the envelope down. He did not need to. The wax seal was unbroken. The paper had yellowed at the edges, which meant it had been written years earlier, and held in trust, a custodian arrangement, meaning a legal structure in which a document is kept by a neutral party until a specific condition is met. The condition, in this case, had been the death of the late Queen's husband and the formal consolidation of Camilla's position as Queen. The envelope had been waiting silently in a solicitor's vault for this precise chapter of the reign. Charles removed his glasses. His hand stopped halfway to his coffee cup. The room fell completely silent. According to documented internal accounts, the letter inside was not long. It was not a decree in the modern sense, a decree being a formal written order carrying the force of institutional authority. It was something stranger and more personal, a sealed instruction written in her own hand, directing that upon her death, and upon Camilla's elevation to the title of Queen, Camilla was to be excluded from the private quarters of every crown residence, Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Sandringham, and Balmoral until a full constitutional review of her role could be completed by the family council. Public duties would continue. Her title would stand. But the doors of the private crown, the bedrooms, the drawing rooms, the corridors where the family actually lived, would be closed to her. Charles read the letter twice, then a third time. On the third reading, he noticed what he had missed: a second sheet, folded behind the first, in a different hand. It was countersigned. Princess Anne had known about the letter for 3 years. She had agreed, as the late Queen had asked her, to serve as custodian of its enforcement. A custodian, in plain terms, being the person trusted to guard and carry out a decision after its author is gone. Anne had not written the order, but she had promised to see it kept. Charles set the letter down on the table, very carefully, as if it were made of glass. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked the secretary. The secretary had no answer, because the answer was already walking through the door. Princess Anne entered without being announced, in the manner she had used since childhood, and she did not sit down. She looked at the envelope. She looked at her brother, and before he could answer his own question, she said the only thing that mattered. "Mother asked me to make sure. I gave her my word." But before Charles could decide whether to rage at his sister or grieve for his wife, Camilla herself would have to be told, and she was already standing in the doorway. Camilla did not cry. She did not shout. She stood in the doorway of the breakfast room in a pale grey coat she had not yet removed, and she listened as her husband, halting, stumbling, twice removing his glasses to clean them, though they were already clean, explained what the envelope contained. The silence was more painful than any shouting could have been. When Charles finally stopped speaking, Camilla walked to the table, reached into her handbag, and removed a single palace key, the private key to the Queen's apartments at Windsor, that she had carried for years, and placed it on the table between them. The small metallic sound it made against the polished wood was, by every private recorded account, the loudest moment of the morning. For Camilla, this was not simply about rooms. It was about what the rooms meant. She had spent 50 years on the wrong side of palace doors, the wrong marriage, the wrong decade, the wrong public. She had waited. She had outlasted. And now, crowned at last, she was being told that the woman who had never approved of her had arranged, from beyond the grave, to lock the private doors of the monarchy in her face. Anne watched her sister-in-law with an expression that gave away nothing. Anne's loyalty was not to Camilla, and it was not even, in the end, to Charles. It was to a promise made to a dying woman, and Anne had never in her life broken a promise. She stood like a sentry, the Princess Royal, a title given to the sovereign's eldest daughter as the crown's most senior working princess, and one Anne had earned through decades of unglamorous institutional duty. It fell to William to arrive next, and William arrived torn. He had known of the envelope's existence for less than a week. He had not known its contents. When he saw the key on the table, he understood immediately what it meant, and his face, by the account of those present, went through something visible. First, the son's instinct to defend his father's wife, then the heir's instinct to defend the late Queen's command. Catherine was with him. She said nothing in front of the family, but as the meeting dissolved into a cold, procedural discussion of logistics, she leaned close to her husband and whispered the counsel that would guide everything that followed. Don't decide anything today. Not as a son, not as an heir, not today. Yet the greater shock lay not in the letter itself, but in what had caused it to be written. Because the letter had a reason, and the reason was a single evening, years earlier, that almost no one knew about. To understand why Elizabeth had taken such an extraordinary step, the family would have to confront the Windsor incident, a private evening at Windsor Castle in the final years of the late Queen's life, with only 4 people present. The Queen herself, Prince Philip in one of his last months of health, Camilla, and a single lady-in-waiting who served the drinks and was then dismissed. No aides, no officials, no minutes taken. What happened in that room had been sealed as completely as the envelope that now lay on Charles's breakfast table. The evening had begun warmly, by all internal accounts. Dinner in the small dining room, a fire, Philip, frail but sharp, asking Camilla about her charity work. And then, late in the evening, as the conversation turned to the future, to what would happen when Philip was gone, when Elizabeth was gone, when Charles finally wore the crown, Camilla made a single request. According to the recorded account the late Queen later dictated to her private secretary, Camilla asked whether, in time, she might be given Balmoral as her own, not borrowed, not assigned for summers, but settled on her personally, as a private retreat of her own, in recognition of everything she had endured. It was, on its surface, a modest request from a woman who had endured decades of humiliation. But to Elizabeth, the words landed like a hand closing on the arm of her chair. Balmoral was not a house. Balmoral was the private soul of the monarchy, the one residence the crown owned outright, not through the state, the place where the Queen had always said she felt most herself. And precedence, the formal order of rank and right that governs every royal ceremony, was something Elizabeth had spent 70 years defending against every erosion, large and small. Philip, according to the same recorded account, answered before his wife could. His reply was cold, brief, and absolute. No private residence of the crown would ever be settled personally on a consort. Because consorts serve the crown does not provide for consorts. And it was Philip, not Elizabeth, who then proposed the arrangement that would become the sealed order. He suggested that a written instruction be prepared and held in trust, to be delivered only after both he and the Queen were gone, so that the new reign would begin with the boundary clearly drawn not as a punishment, he insisted, but as a protection. The Queen consort, meaning the wife of a reigning king, crowned beside him but holding no sovereign power of her own, would have every public honour. But the private crown would remain the family's alone. Elizabeth had hesitated. By the account she later dictated, she hesitated for almost a year. She had grown in her final years to respect Camilla's endurance. But respect and trust were not the same thing, and in the end the memory of that request, a private claim on the family's most private place, outweighed everything else. She signed the instruction. Philip countersigned it. Anne was made its custodian, and then all 3 of them said nothing and waited for death to deliver it. But the letter's origin, however coldly reasoned, could not soften its arrival, and within days it would force a confrontation in a closed room that none of them could avoid. The confrontation happened at Clarence House in Charles's private study on a Sunday evening when the house had been deliberately emptied. No courtiers remained, no officials stood ready. The staff had been given the night off, and the doors were locked from inside. Only Charles and Camilla faced each other across the desk, where the letter lay between them, as it had lain between them for 4 days without either of them touching it. Charles began with the only defense he had. I didn't know. You have to believe me, I didn't know. Camilla's accusation was quieter and far more devastating. She did not accuse him of writing the letter. She accused him of building her a life, made entirely of his mother's permission. Every title, every honor, Every slow step from pariah to queen had been granted by Elizabeth's tolerance, and now Elizabeth's final word had revealed how conditional that tolerance had always been. "I was never accepted," Camilla said, by the account of that evening. "I was only ever supervised." Charles removed his glasses. He had no answer, because it was true. And then Camilla revealed what she had not told him. Before he could answer, she took from her handbag a second folded sheet, the countersigned page, and laid it beside the first. She had gone to Anne herself, alone, the previous afternoon. And Anne, in the cold honesty that was her only register, had shown Camilla the letter's final clause, the clause Charles himself had not yet read to the end. The exclusion was not permanent. It lasted only until the family council completed its review, and the review could be closed by a single act, a written acceptance, signed by Camilla, renouncing any personal claim to the private residences forever. Sign the renunciation, a formal written surrender of a claim or right, and the doors would reopen. Refuse, and the doors would stay closed. Charles stared at the clause. His mother had not banished his wife. She had built a test Camilla could only pass by surrendering the very thing she had once asked for. The cruelty of it was surgical. The wisdom of it was undeniable. "She never believed I wanted you," Camilla said quietly. "She always believed I wanted the houses." The silence was more painful than the letter had been. But before Camilla could decide whether to sign or to refuse, William would have to face the choice that had been left, deliberately, to him. Because the final clause named a witness. The renunciation, to take effect, had to be countersigned by the heir, by William. His grandmother had arranged for her great test to rest, in the end, in the hands of the future king. William read the document twice in his study at Kensington Palace, alone at his desk, with the rain against the windows, and he understood that he was not being asked to witness a signature. He was being asked to ratify a precedent being an earlier decision that becomes the rule for all similar decisions to come. Whatever he signed now would bind every consort of every reign that followed his. Catherine found him still at the desk past midnight. She read the clause over his shoulder, and then she asked him the one quiet question that defined everything. "Are you deciding as a son or as an heir?" William did not answer for a long time. As a son, he wanted to tear the document in half. His father's marriage had cost his father everything once already. The monarchy had punished that love for 30 years, and here was its final invoice, presented after the creditors were dead. As an heir, he saw what his grandmother had seen. The crown could not survive if its private foundations could be claimed by affection, however deep, however deserved. A consort's love was real. A consort's claim was not. He picked up the pen, he set it down, he picked it up again. And then, by the account of that night, he did something no one had expected. He folded the renunciation unsigned, placed it in the red dispatch box beside his desk, and wrote a single line across the folder. "The decision belongs to the Queen herself. The heir witnesses, but does not compel." He would sign, but only after Camilla chose freely, and only in her presence, and never as the instrument of her humiliation. The reign he would one day inherit, he told Catherine, would not begin with a coerced signature on a dead woman's order. Precedent could wait 1 week, dignity could not. Yet while the family argued over signatures and clauses, the order's machinery was already moving, and its material consequences were about to become impossible to hide. Enforcement began on a Monday, and it began with keys. At Buckingham Palace, the master of the household quietly collected the Queen's private access keys from the household registry. At Windsor Castle, the superintendent of the royal apartments logged the removal of Camilla's personal effects from the Queen's private suite, her reading chair, her photographs, the small writing desk she had used for her correspondence. At Sandringham, where the family gathered each winter, the guest lists for the coming season were redrawn with a line of ink that placed the Queen's name among the official visitors rather than the resident family. At Balmoral, where the request that caused everything had first been made, the private wing was closed entirely, its shuttered, its fires unlit, pending the council's review. The Controlled Access Protocol, the bureaucratic term for the system that decides who may enter, which rooms of a royal residence, and when, was rewritten in a single afternoon. Camilla's name remained on every public engagement. She would still open hospitals, still attend state dinners, still stand beside the king at the balcony. But the protocol now listed her private access as suspended pending review, a phrase that appeared, by internal accounts, on no fewer than 400 pages of household documentation. Staff moving through the suite did so in silence. An inventory was taken of every object the Queen had left behind, each item catalogued and photographed, as if she were a tenant whose lease had expired. The cruelty of bureaucracy is that it has no voice and no face. No one had shouted at Camilla, no one had barred a door in her presence. The institution had simply rearranged its paperwork, and a woman who was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom found that she no longer had a key to her own husband's castle. Camilla bore it, by every account, with a restraint that unsettled even her critics. She attended a charity luncheon that week and smiled for the photographers. But those who knew her noticed that she had removed the diamond brooch she always wore, the one Charles had given her on their wedding day, and in its place wore nothing at all. Yet the inventories and the protocols were only the institution's language. The family still had to speak in its own, and that meant a final private conversation in a deliberately modest room where the truth could finally be said. Camilla requested the meeting herself. Not at Windsor, not at the palace, at Clarence House. In the small back drawing room where she and Charles had taken their morning coffee for 20 years, before crowns and ciphers and sealed letters had entered the room. She asked for no staff, no advisors, no witnesses. Charles came alone. She had the renunciation with her. She laid it on the low table between the two worn armchairs, beside a folded napkin she had carried from the breakfast room that first morning, the morning of the key. And then she made her confession, and it was not the confession Charles expected. "She was right to doubt me," Camilla said, by the account of that evening. "That night at Windsor, I did ask for Balmoral. I told myself it was because I had earned it, but that wasn't the truth. The truth is, I wanted one thing in this entire institution that no one could ever take back. I wanted proof that I had finally stopped being a guest." Charles removed his glasses. For once, he did not clean them. He simply held them in his hand and looked at his wife. Camilla did not cry. Her voice stayed level, controlled, almost formal, the voice of a woman who had rehearsed this once and would never rehearse it again. She said she understood now what Elizabeth had understood, that a love which must be proven by property is a love the institution will always fear. She had not married a house. She had married a man who happened to be trapped inside one. And if the price of standing beside him for the rest of her life was signing away every private door, then she would sign, not because her title had changed, but because trust had, and trust, once lost, could only be repurchased with exactly the currency Elizabeth had demanded. Charles apologized then, not for the letter, which he had not written, but for the years in which he had let his wife believe that endurance alone would one day be enough. "I should have told you the doors were never mine to open," he said. "They belong to the Crown, and so, in the end, do I." Camilla picked up the pen. She signed the renunciation slowly, in her own hand, each letter deliberate, and the signing transformed the meaning of everything. The sealed order was no longer a banishment. It had become the instrument of her vindication. Elizabeth had designed a test to expose a grasping consort. What it had exposed instead was a woman who would surrender every house in the kingdom, rather than surrender her marriage. But the signature was a private act, and the monarchy never stays private for long. Within days, the country would know that something had happened behind the palace walls. The palace released a carefully worded statement on a Friday afternoon, timed, as such statements always are, to the quietest hour of the news week. It confirmed that a private family matter concerning the occupancy of Crown residences, arising from arrangements made by the late Queen, has been resolved by mutual agreement, and that Her Majesty the Queen's public duties are unaffected. It was 41 words long. It explained nothing. It ignited everything. By Saturday morning, broadcasters had interrupted normal programming. Correspondents stood in the rain outside Buckingham Palace describing a seismic internal reckoning, while the scrolling banners beneath them reached for language the statement had refused to provide. One Sunday newspaper framed it in the headline that would outlive all the others: "The door closes on Camilla's inner palace power." Another, more sympathetic, wrote of the Queen who signed away the keys. And then came the moment the broadcasters would repeat for weeks. Outside the gates of Clarence House, among the small crowd of tourists and loyalists who had gathered with their phones and their umbrellas, an elderly woman stepped forward and fixed a handwritten sign to the railings with ribbon. It read, in shaky block letters, "She gave up the house. She kept the king." A passerby photographed it. By evening, the photograph had been shown on every major bulletin, cited by presenters as the defining symbol of public reaction the instant the story stopped being about an institution's cold machinery and became in the public mind about a marriage that had survived the ultimate audit. The late Queen's letter had been meant to draw a boundary. Instead, it had given Camilla the one thing 50 years of endurance never could, a public that finally believed her. Yet public sympathy, however warming, settled nothing inside the family. The reckoning still had to happen, and it happened where it had begun, at Clarence House, with the doors locked and the advisers gone. Charles, Anne, William, and Camilla met in the small drawing room on the final evening. Catherine was present, but sat apart, near the window, saying nothing. The moral compass does not need to speak when the needle has already settled. Sophie had wanted to attend, by some accounts, as a voice of restraint, but Camilla had asked that the circle be kept to the four whose names the letter had touched. Charles spoke first. He admitted fault plainly, without the cushioning of royal grammar. He had known his mother too well to be truly surprised, and he had failed his wife by never preparing her for the possibility that the dead might still govern the living. He thanked Anne, and here his voice tightened, for keeping a promise he could never have kept himself, and for keeping it exactly as their mother had asked, without softening it, without leaking it, without using it. Anne, the cold institutional guardian, accepted the thanks with a single nod. It had cost her, those who knew her said, more than anyone realized. Loyalty to the late Queen's memory had required her to stand, for weeks, as the enemy of her own brother's marriage. Then Charles turned to Camilla and apologized in front of the family, not privately this time, but formally, so that there would be witnesses to it forever. And Camilla, gracious in defeat and greater in victory, accepted with restraint. She had the signed renunciation on the table. She slid it, not to her husband, but to Anne the custodian, because the document had never really belonged to anyone else. William performed the final gesture. He opened the folder, read the signature once more, and countersigned the renunciation as witness, as the clause required. But on the folder itself, beneath his earlier note, he wrote a second line, by the account of that evening. Witnessed freely, in the presence of family. Let this precedent record her choice, not our demand. Then he closed the folder, and the matter, the sealed order, the countersigned page, the 400 pages of protocol was finished. The private doors reopened within the month. The keys were returned, and in the household registry, beside the restored entries, a clerk noted the review's conclusion in a single bureaucratic sentence. No further exclusion required. For Anne, it had been about a promise. For William, about precedent. For Charles, about a debt to two women he could never fully repay. For Camilla, it had never been about houses at all. In the end, the sealed order revealed a truth the monarchy has been learning for 1,000 years. Power could protect love, but it could not make every private wish legitimate. A crown may be inherited, but trust is only ever earned, and sometimes it must be earned twice, once in life and once against the judgment of the dead. The institution survived the sealed letter the way it survives everything. Bruised but steadier, its boundaries redrawn not by force but by a signature freely given. Camilla kept her crown, her husband, and in the strange arithmetic of royal survival her dignity, because she finally understood that love may stand beside the crown, but it cannot stand above it. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.